Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our February 12th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and in today's episode, American Farm Bureau economist Betty Resnick shares her thoughts on some major ag market drivers in 2024. Then, Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent joins us to preview a few national policy priorities for the months ahead. We'll kick things off in Salt Lake City, where spokesman reporter Bob Beyond caught up with economist Betty Resnick to discuss trade and shipping challenges, renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel opportunities, and more at the American Farm Bureau Annual Convention in late January.
Welcome, Betty. Thanks for being with us today. Just had a great session discussing crop markets in a volatile world. Before we get started, how about telling us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Betty Resnick. I am an economist at American Farm Bureau covering row crops, farm bill, and trade. I started about 6 months ago, and the Farm Bureau family's been amazing to me so far. I'm originally from Lenexa, Kansas, and I went to college at Mississippi State for undergrad and graduate school before heading out to California for a few years working in specialty crops. So it's been great to be back in the row crop world.
So let's start with general trade. The United States is running at a deficit now, you mentioned. You called this kind of unprecedented, especially the decrease in exports and export value. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so traditionally the United States has always had a big surplus of agricultural exports. However, in the past 5 years, we're going our third year projected of a deficit, which is, again, really unprecedented in U.S. agricultural trade. And the deficit next year in 2024 is projected to be at $30.5 billion. That's huge. And I'm not necessarily worried about that from the import perspective. I'm worried about that because of the decline in exports. So 2023 was a record export year. And we've seen declines in that both due to sagging commodity prices, but also due to the strong U.S. dollar.
So any products in countries that we're dealing with more so than others, maybe products to start with, and then the countries that we're seeing more of a deficit?
So we don't import and export the same products. We import a lot of horticultural products, about 50% of our imports. And horticultural products, it sounds a little strange, but it includes alcohol. So we import a lot of tequila, vodka, beer. We import a lot of coffee. About 5% of our imports are coffee. Essential oils are about 5%, and then a lot of out-of-season fruit products as well. While we export a lot of things y'all grow in Iowa, so a lot of commodities, bulk commodities, things that aren't necessarily have that much value added, that's what we export.
Any countries in particular that are maybe at a deficit with the United States here?
So Canada and Mexico are both countries that we import and export a lot of. So from 2018 to 2022, our exports to Mexico actually increased 47%, but I'm not quite sure what our imports increased over the same time period. We're importing more and more of those. People really like Mexican beer and things like that. That's where a lot of our imports are coming in from as well.
So overall, what are we seeing for overall trade in the short and long term?
In the short term, one of the only silver linings of some sagging commodity prices, hopefully we see exports start to pick back up in quantity demanded. In addition, with a weakening U.S. dollar, we've had some really record high U.S. dollars in recent years, and that's affected our ability to export. In the long term, we haven't had a new free trade agreement. Now, USMCA technically new, but we had NAFTA before. And they're in force since 2012, over 11 years ago. And a lot of other countries around the world are signing free trade agreements at record pace. So that's a big concern for U.S. agriculture as we are potentially losing ground on new market access.
Well, let's switch to biofuels.
Okay.
What's the takeaway there? You mentioned a massive increase in the market, specifically renewable diesel.
Yeah, so we've been having booming renewable diesel since 2021, and I would argue that 2023 is at a pivot point. The majority of diesel consumed in California is now renewable diesel, which is pretty crazy. That's a very subsidized product, so we're seeing the big increase in a large part due to subsidies, as it's an expensive product to build as compared to petroleum diesel. But we've got to see moving forward whether or not those subsidies are going to keep up with the increase in capacity or whether other demand factors are going to fit in. So there's a lot of promise in biofuels and renewable diesel. It's still much smaller than the ethanol industry at this point, but we're going to have to continue to see how it continues to grow and at what growth rate it continues to move forward at.
There also was a lot of excitement about sustainable aviation fuel. Where are we headed with SAF? Massive potential there.
Yeah, absolutely massive. And I think it's a great strategic choice for the U.S. agricultural industry to be interested in sustainable aviation fuel, because that's not going to be at a risk of electrification at all. Renewable diesel is a tween. Sustainable aviation fuel is a baby. So we got to wait and see what's going to happen there. The Inflation Reduction Act included some really good subsidies for sustainable aviation fuel. They recently adopted the GREAT model, which is a positive for U.S. agriculture. And the next policy development we're waiting on is to see what they change the GREAT model to be. They're supposed to announce that by March 1st, so I'll be waiting for that. But sustainable aviation fuel has massive, massive potential, but we're going to have to wait and see what U.S. Ag's relationship with it's going to be.
You talked a little bit about the weather. How is the weather affecting global markets, and in particular Brazil?
Yeah, so we're in an El Nino cycle, and we will be through the spring, and that has a lot of inputs for crops around the world. El Nino is both the reason that we're having drought in the Mid-South in the United States, but also why they're having drought in some big production regions in Brazil, and also why they're having record low water levels at the Panama Canal. But with Brazil, that's kind of the big next market mover we all have on our calendars. The reports that are coming out of Brazil are like the crop estimates, some of them are extremely low, but that also might be a little pessimistic. The United States, USDA has downgraded Brazil's forecasted soybean production to like about 157 million metric tons. We'll see if it drops lower or not, but Brazil's a really big country, and what people are also forgetting about is that Argentina's having a really good crop, so they might be able to kind of make up for some of that decline in Brazilian soybeans. But I guess basically Brazil had really bad dryness and hot weather during their soybean production season, which might be familiar to y'all from last summer as well.
So let's go on to shipping. You talked about issues that we're facing there, and specifically global choke points. Could you explain that?
So there are many global choke points that affect maritime trade. So maritime trade globally accounts for about 80 to 90% of all trade worldwide. And choke points include a lot of canals and also areas where two continents are very close and someone can try to control that choke point. So some choke points include the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, which is on the other side of the Red Sea, the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and the Panama Canal. And ships have to go through there to make trade efficiently. And if we have issues at those choke points, it can really devastate global trade.
And we're having some issues, right? Specifically in Panama, the low water levels. And then you also talked about the Red Sea region. Maybe you could expand on that and maybe solutions that we're going to see maybe down the road, hopefully.
Yeah. So for the United States, the Panama Canal is our most critical choke point. If you want to ship grain from New Orleans to Tokyo, if you go through the Panama Canal, it takes 32 days. If you go through the Red Sea, it takes about 50 days. And if you go through the Cape of Good Hope, it's about 54 days. So if you have to go through the Cape of Good Hope around southern Africa instead of Panama, that's going to take an additional 3 weeks. That increases your transportation cost. And unfortunately, we're seeing that happen because the Panama Canal is having some record low water levels because they didn't get rain this year. And I think we've all learned a lot about water levels the past few years with issues on the Mississippi as well. The Panama Canal, due to El Nino, did not get rain this year. Every single ship going through the Panama Canal uses about 60 Olympic swimming pools worth of water. And they're trying to make that more and more water efficient. However, they've reduced capacity by over a third through the Panama Canal over the past 6 months. End of October of this year, traditionally about 80% of grain would be going through the Panama Canal from New Orleans to East Asia. This October, it was down to about 10%, and over 90% of grain was instead going through the Suez Canal. Well, we might have heard about some conflict in the Middle East since then, and since then, the Houthi terrorist organization in Yemen have been trying to bomb global ships going through the Red Sea, and now that's kind of cut off in terms of trade. So now all of those ships are going to have to be going through the Cape of Good Hope, which takes an additional 3 weeks. So the issues on the Red Sea and the Panama Canal are combining to make it even harder to trade.
And maybe we can expand on those global conflicts just a little bit. We have multiple conflicts, and they're affecting shipping and therefore markets and trade. Could you expand on that, and we'll kind of end with that?
Cool. Yeah. So there's a lot of wild cards to still be figured out in 2024. The situation in the Red Sea right now is extremely dynamic. We're going to wait and see what's going to happen there. And typically, from a grain perspective, I wouldn't be that worried about the Red Sea because that mainly affects European exports to Asia and East Africa. But because of the issues in the Panama Canal, it's really affecting us. Some other wild cards I mentioned. So that Red Sea situation, it's going to make transportation more expensive overall. And because of the Panama Canal, it's affecting U.S. exports more, but it's going to affect European crops even more. So potentially it's a good thing for the United States and makes our exports more attractive, just as we saw when they had such a hard time and continue to have a hard time exporting Ukrainian crops. And we all knew what happened when we had record prices stemming from that conflict. Expanded conflict through the Middle East is a real concern, and that's going to affect our national security, but also it's going to affect trade in all dimensions. We'll continue to watch the U.S.-China relationship and see if tensions ebb or flow there. Something I don't think is going to happen in 2024, but it's worthwhile thinking through the impacts of what will happen when the war in Ukraine ends and those Ukrainian exports can get out further and further. How is that going to affect global grain markets? And then also 2024 is a record election year. Not only do we have an election, it's the biggest election year in world history. Over 50% of humans on Earth will be in a country with a major election this year. So Canada, Mexico, US, Taiwan just had one. I think India had one this year. A lot of people will be voting, and that always has a chance to change the relationships between countries.
Thanks, Betty. I think that many farmers are becoming painfully aware of the market disruptions beyond our borders, but it's still important to keep tabs on those situations and to keep our eyes on some of the new opportunities that renewable fuels are presenting us as well. Speaking of opportunities, we recently sat down with Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johnson to discuss the openings that he sees for national policy breakthroughs in 2024. For that, here's Spokesman Editor Tom Block with President Johnson on the heels of American Farm Bureau's annual convention.
Brent, you just came back from the American Farm Bureau Convention where a lot of activity happened. Can you summarize for us the highlights of the conference and how the Iowa Farm Bureau fared and the policies its members brought forth?
Yeah, it was actually a really busy several days out in Salt Lake City. The members who were competing did very well. The members who were represented us very well. I would say overall, it was an extremely productive week. We had young farmers competing in their competitions, and the innovative challenge, he ended up getting in the top 4 with his fire retardant product. That was fantastic. And then one of the highlights was former President Craig Hill was the recipient of the Founders Award this year. And the Founders Award is given to one person every year, somebody who's really made an impact on the American Farm Bureau and agriculture as a whole. And for him to be recognized for his previous efforts on waters of the U.S. and some of his work on crop insurance programs and different things through his years, it was really appropriate and well received that Craig got that Founders Award this year, and he was very touched by it as well. So it was a really shining moment for the Iowa Farm Bureau and Craig Hill.
And then the culmination of the convention every year is the policy setting session, the delegate session. What were some of the policies that our members brought forth through our statewide process, forwarded them to American Farm Bureau, and then debated on the floor there and got in the policy book?
Yeah, policy is certainly the main reason why we do go out there. And our members this year brought forward several policies around CRP and supporting biofuels. And basically, we got everything in there that we needed to get in. And then in addition to that, there's been a renewed energy, if you will, around the concept of interstate commerce and how one state's rules or laws shouldn't dictate processes in another state. And so the Iowa Farm Bureau and our members, we brought forward some language to help address some of that. It was adopted unanimously.
Why is that resolution so important, especially for Iowa, but also nationwide, and the impacts it might have?
Yeah, this concept of interstate commerce is extremely important because without it, we're going to see a patchwork of these types of rules from other states dictating production. And, today the conversation is in the swine industry, and it's been in the poultry industry. Will it come to the beef industry, the dairy industry, corn production, avocados, wine? Where does this stop? It becomes impossible to navigate the patchwork of regulations that's possible out of states dealing with all of the different commodities and ultimately, a widget produced by a company for any other purpose. So the concept of capitalism and states' rights, the economics behind that, why the United States is the power that it is, interstate commerce is at the foundation of all of that. And we need to make sure that that's solidly in place for the future.
In a few weeks, Iowa Farm Bureau will be leading a market study tour out to California to learn more about how Prop 12 is being implemented in California. What do you see as the potential learning opportunities from that trip?
We've got a group of maybe around 20 people that are going out there. It's a trip to ask some questions, get into some California government agencies, and try to answer some of these things, put some boots on the ground, if you will, and get some firsthand knowledge, experience, background, and updates as to how Proposition 12 and the like is actually affecting the consumer side of the conversation out there in California, share what the challenges have become on the production side of this conversation here, and ultimately try to get to some point of understanding and a little bit of insight as to other thoughts that potentially we're facing. And I'll be very interested to hear what the reports are coming back and being able to download the trip and ultimately use that trip from our members and their questions and their experiences to advance Iowa agriculture strongly into the future.
Now, another thing that was announced at the AFBF convention was a program that had its roots in Iowa and is now being broadened nationwide through the support of AFBF, and that's the Farm Family Wellness Alliance and Together All. What was Iowa Farm Bureau's involvement, and what does that mean to farmers?
This was a highlight as far as an announcement made by AFBF across the entire country. And this Farm Family Wellness Alliance was really something that came about shortly after the derecho came through a few years ago. So the concept is really mental health and producers across the state as it was and now across the country. And sometimes it's okay to know that you're not okay, to ask for help and to find those situations. So as the derecho came through several years ago, the Iowa Farm Bureau partnered with Iowa State University and this alliance and really provided some resources for those folks who were experiencing an extremely difficult time. Eventually, that found its way into Illinois, and now proudly, AFBF has picked it up, and it is now providing a place for producers to go to ask questions, to find help, to find mentors, peers, specialists to help them with any stresses, mental health issues, any challenges. It's all anonymous. It's free of charge. It's a resource like no other in any part of the country right now that's available to producers in their unique circumstances and situations, that we can now have a resource for folks to dive into some really difficult and many times personal issues.
Let's turn our attention now to policy issues, things that are being discussed out in Washington, D.C. One of the big ones is the Farm Bill. What's the status of the Farm Bill right now?
Yeah, we all know that there's a challenging situation in Washington, D.C. right now, politics being what it is and the dysfunction of that. As far as the status of the Farm Bill, we continue to meet, we continue to have those conversations, and the passage of a bipartisan Farm Bill is extremely important, and we need to get that done here early in this year so that we can get a bipartisan piece of legislation passed ahead of presidential politics that we all know is coming, and avoid extensions and be able to secure the risk management tools that producers need at a time when the economics are becoming challenging.
Yeah, and that leads us into our next question. Planting season will be here before we know it. What do you think the outlook is for crop markets here in 2024?
Well, we've had a couple really good years as far as crop production goes. Staying on that side of the equation, it does look like we've got some challenging couple years coming at us. Yeah, we've had a little bit of relief on the cost side of the balance sheet, and that's certainly helpful, but we've had probably a larger reduction in the income side of the balance sheet. As we enter the growing season for 2024, that's proving to create some tight cash flows, and that's certainly a real situation for a lot of folks. On the livestock situation, the hog industry has had a really difficult time, and some of these situations like Proposition 12 and these states' initiatives just absolutely compound that issue. And the beef sector, it seems like perpetually they have their ups and downs, opportunities and challenges, and that all looks to continue as well.
And that makes the Farm Bill more important than ever. I'm seeing notes out of Extension where we have to make the choice. ARC and PLC and some of those programs, some of those safety nets are going to come into play. So that really sort of elevates that importance of the Farm Bill.
Yeah, it does. And one of the initiatives that we're trying to get across is to modernize the cost structure of the Farm Bill. So when the Farm Bill was passed several years ago and where we're at today, we're in two different economic situations. So those programs like ARC and PLC, they're just not being triggered like maybe they should be in today's elevated cost structures. So to get some modernization within the Farm Bill is certainly one of those key aspects.
And with the economic challenges that you mentioned, trade is more important than ever. What's Farm Bureau doing to advance relationships with potential trading partners?
Yeah, we continue to be, frankly, frustrated at the federal administration's lack of trade initiatives. We continue to engage the topic, and at the Iowa Farm Bureau with the state of Iowa, we will be going to Mexico here in just a couple weeks. We've sent members across the country this last year. So myself, personally, I've been to Vietnam and Singapore. I've sent other people to South Korea, Japan, Colombia, Canada, the UK, and to continue to explore those opportunities and find the spaces where us as farmers, us as the Iowa Farm Bureau, the state of Iowa, how we can engage the concept of international trade in this time of really dysfunction when it comes to the federal administration's lack of doing their responsibility when it comes to promoting USA products.
Mm-hmm. And as you know, whenever you have kind of that farmer-to-farmer exchange or farmer-to-buyer exchange, those relationships are always very valuable.
Yeah, we continue to find that specifically when I've gone over and met with different feed mills in other parts of the world or different processors that are looking for U.S. produced corn or soybeans or whatever the products are. There's many times where being a farmer in that conversation, talking to them about our production standards, the way that we do what we do and how we transport what we transport, and all of those pieces together puts a personal touch on that relationship. And as widespread as global trade is, to bridge the gap a little bit with some personal stories and have those tangible touches, I think is really important when it comes to solidifying some of those extended business relationships.
A month ago, you were reelected to your second term as president of the Iowa Farm Bureau. So as we wrap up, just talk about how things are going with the organization and what you see ahead.
Yeah, proudly serving in this now second term, absolutely humbled and energized at the same time by the confidence that our members have in where we're at and really where we're going. And to highlight some of that, we always have membership goals, and we've increased membership fairly significantly this year. We're reached a nice milestone. I know we've got some challenges ahead with some industry things and whatnot, but hopefully our members find a sense of value and belonging to an organization that is really, truly leading the way when it comes to looking out for what's best for Iowa agriculture, for Iowa's producers, and finding those opportunities for single base hits, creating a win, just ratcheting forward this conversation wherever it leads us, whether it's here within the city of Des Moines, Washington, D.C., or other cities and countries across the world. I'm confident that the Iowa Farm Bureau will be there, will be in those conversations, and I'm excited for the future of agriculture and the future of Iowa.
As you just heard President Johnson say, when times are tough, it's important to continue getting base hits and wins for agriculture. And you can't do that unless you're right in the middle of the action, always ready to take a swing and move ag's priorities forward. As Iowa's largest grassroots farm organization, that's what Farm Bureau does every day, and we're proud to be doing that work alongside you and on your behalf. That brings us to the end of this episode, but before we wrap up, we want to highlight an upcoming event for farmers that has attracted capacity crowds the last couple of years. Iowa Farm Bureau's Acres of Opportunity Conference is scheduled for Saturday, March 16th in Ottumwa. This conference is a great chance for aspiring and established farmers to explore niche and specialty ag opportunities like fruit and vegetable production, direct-to-consumer meat marketing, and much more. This conference has actually been sold out for the last couple of years, so I'd encourage you to register and secure your spot today. Registration is free for Iowa Farm Bureau members and $60 for non-members. And you can find more information and register through the link down in the notes for this episode or by visiting iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next one on February 26th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.